What's up, everybody, and welcome back to Fireside Giants. I'm your host, Anthony Rivardo, joined by my co-host, Alex Wilson. And the New York Giants are deep in preparation for the upcoming 2023 NFL Draft, which takes place 1 week from today. I am super excited for the draft. We've been talking about it for months and months and months. And of course, we're going to continue to update you all on every single piece of draft news and rumors surrounding the New York Giants right here on Fireside Giants. So make sure to subscribe. But today, we want to talk about General Manager Joe Schoen. He did his pre-draft presser today, and he did share a good bit of insight, not only on the Giants draft process, but also on some of the housekeeping things going on with Dexter Lawrence, Saquon Barkley, and a few other major details regarding this current team. But right now, it's very clear and obvious that Joe Schoen's primary focus is on the 2023 NFL Draft. What the Giants are going to do at 25. He said he's confident, but he doesn't know exactly who they're picking just yet. He also said that it's much more difficult to predict who's going to be on the board at 25 than it was last year for 5 and 7. So sounds like the Giants have a much looser plan going into this year's draft, but we're just going to go ahead and react to some of these main quotes and main points from Joe Schoen's presser in today's episode. But before we do all of that, make sure to leave a like if you do enjoy today's episode. And again, subscribe to Fireside Giants if you're new, and ring the bell so you don't miss an episode. And if you're listening on Apple or Spotify, please leave us a 5-star review. But without further ado, Alex, how are you doing today, my friend? And what are your thoughts on Joe Schoen's presser?
Well, he said a whole lot of nothing at times, and his primary sequence was, haven't talked to Saquon, haven't talked to him in 3 weeks, gotta go ask Saquon, I don't know what Saquon's thinking, I don't know what his representatives, basically the same thing over and over and over again. He does not know what Saquon is thinking, he does not know if he's going to show up, he does not know if he's going to stay away, and ultimately, he said something interesting that did spark my interest in that when they were discussing a potential extension before free agency, he said something specific that I really was like, whoa, okay. He said, we had a ceiling. He was like, we had a mark that we were going to reach, and if they went beyond that, we were going to wait and not basically go any further. And that was $12 million. That was the report a couple months ago that was kind of indicated that the Giants were willing to give him $12 million per season, and he was like, no, I want more. Or at least his representatives were. Now, Saquon did come out and say, I'm not trying to be crazy. I want to be fair. I'm not looking for McCaffrey money. I know my worth. I know I've been dealing with injuries. Kind of put himself in an interesting spot. And the Giants basically still aren't interested because his representatives probably are trying to get the best deal, which is what they're supposed to do. But they also put him in a tough spot because now the Giants are like, well, if you want that much, we're not coming down, so good luck. And you look at what the running back market looks like right now, it does not indicate that anyone is paying any running back over $12 million. So Saquon, unfortunately, while a phenomenal player, and I do think he will end up playing for this team in 2023, his long-term future with the club, long-term future beyond this upcoming season is surely in question. And if I had to put my money down right now, I'd say after this upcoming year, he's probably gone. And that's definitely unfortunate, but it's just the reality of the business, the reality of the running back position right now, and the reality of how we're kind of perceiving Joe Schoen's comments. So, what do you think about Saquon's situation right now? Because it was very clear that Joe Schoen did not want to talk about it. He kept saying, nothing has changed. I haven't spoken to him. Clearly, there's no information he wants to divulge. Clearly, they're at a standstill. He seemed pissed about it. Honestly, the way that he spoke about everything else, but then when people came up with that exact same thing, they kept asking him the same questions. He was very, very standoffish. He shut it down immediately. He sounded a little bit angered. But then on the other hand, Dexter Lawrence, he was like, we're having great dialogue with his representatives. Everything's going well. It's going positive. We're really hopeful on that end. Everything's doing really, making good progress, and the communication is certainly there. So, you hear the two different tones of voice, and they're quite different. In my opinion, I took that as, he's kind of been rubbed the wrong way by Saquon's reps and what they're asking for. And when it comes to Dexter Lawrence, and now positional value certainly is playing a big part here. Dexter Lawrence is a big part of this defense, a big part of this team, and we're going to discuss what he said about Wink Martindale's defense in a little bit. But give me your take on Saquon Barkley first.
Yeah, so the most eye-opening part of this presser for me was when this was the exact question that Joe Schoen was asked. Do you remain optimistic that Saquon will be on the field for you at the start of the season? From the outside looking in, it doesn't seem like an obvious resolution. And then Joe Schoen simply just said, you have to ask him. I'm not sure. I don't know what his plan is. I haven't talked to him in probably 3 weeks. That was that. So he couldn't even say whether or not Saquon was going to be on the field this season. Saquon has not communicated to Joe Schoen and to the New York Giants whether or not he would be playing for the New York Giants this upcoming season. So you were kind of saying there that you think that Saquon's going to be on the field for the Giants this year, but maybe not in years forthcoming. But I don't know. Joe Schoen didn't say that he was optimistic. He said that he legitimately has no clue and that he hasn't heard from Saquon, and Saquon hasn't communicated whether or not he intends to play this season. And I do think that's really interesting. I think it's very eye-opening, and it really kind of just demonstrates, it sheds a light on how tense this situation is. It feels tense. This feels a lot more tense than, comparatively speaking, the Dexter Lawrence situation that you just mentioned. Now, there's a few reasons for that. Of course, Saquon Barkley technically not under contract. He hasn't signed the franchise tender. He's technically not a member of the New York Giants in a way. He doesn't have to sign that thing. Of course, he won't be able to play unless he signs a franchise tender, but right now he's not under contract. He's not even allowed in the New York Giants building right now because he hasn't signed his franchise tender. Dexter Lawrence, different story. They picked up the fifth-year option. He is under contract. He is obligated to play for the Giants this upcoming season. He can hold out all he wants to try and get a new contract, but he is under contract and he does have to play. Saquon Barkley doesn't have to do that. He has no obligation to be in the building. In fact, he has an obligation to stay away from the building for now. So it'll be interesting to see what happens, and it's kind of just one of these things where there's a week until the 2023 NFL Draft. There might be a team out there that's willing to pay Saquon. The Giants haven't been speaking to Saquon. Doesn't sound like they're on a very friendly vibe right now. Maybe he gets traded. I don't even want to rule out that possibility. I know it's kind of deviating away from the conversation about, Joe Schoen's presser points today, but just kind of speculating here based on some of the things he said. And I know a lot of people on Twitter, a lot of fans right now are getting this similar vibe. Maybe the Giants are considering making an early exit on Saquon Barkley, moving on from him sooner rather than later. I mean, you kind of think about it from a logical perspective. If like Alex, you were just saying, you feel pretty confident that Saquon's not going to be here in 2024. If that's the case, wouldn't you rather trade him and get some sort of draft capital for him now rather than him walking away in free agency for nothing but maybe a compensatory pick next year? And so that's kind of where I think this conversation gets really interesting. Maybe there is a team in the market for a superstar playmaker for their offense, and Saquon Barkley could potentially be available for trade as things start to get even more tense between the Giants and Barkley. Now, again, I do think that he's going to be on the field wearing a New York Giants uniform this season. I agree with you, Alex, but right now it is very tense, and I think it's worth noting that when tense conversation discussions happen right ahead of the NFL draft, other teams take notice of that, and other teams put players on their list of potential trade targets. That's what happened with A.J. Brown last year, and that's how he ended up in Philadelphia. He was having tense conversations with the Tennessee Titans. They weren't able to get a deal done. Philadelphia said, we need a receiver, and we will pay this guy, so let's go ahead and trade for him. This happens pretty much every year. It is possible that Saquon Barkley could be that draft day trade this year. Now, again, I'm not counting on it. I'm not saying that will happen, but I do think it's worth noting that this is a tense situation, and the lack of communication between Saquon Barkley and the New York Giants, or at least Saquon Barkley's representatives, it's something worth noting, and we'll see how this plays out, but I'm curious to see how it plays out. And so now, speaking to your other point about Dexter Lawrence, I'll let you get a chance to kind of share the quote that Joe Schoen had regarding Wink Martindale's front seven and the difference in defensive schematics. But I will say, he also mentioned taking a look at how contracts keep getting reset. The market keeps getting reset on defensive tackles. And Joe Schoen had his fair share of things to say about that. But I will say, he just looked way more confident in the fact that they're going to get a deal done with Dexter Lawrence than he does with Saquon Barkley. And honestly, I feel like that's a deal that could get done well before training camp, and I certainly hope it does. But Alex, what are your thoughts on what Joe Schoen had to say about Dexter Lawrence and Wink Martindale's defense?
I mean, look, the truth is, Dexter Lawrence knows he's getting extended, right? The Giants want to keep him for the long term, so obviously that is going to be a priority. Now, I'll say this. I do think that when it comes to Wink Martindale, ultimately the defensive scheme is going to change because eventually Wink Martindale is going to get a head coaching job. Eventually he's going to leave, and the Giants need to be prepared for that. And Joe Schoen referenced an awesome quote he heard from Bill Parcells several years ago, and he said sometimes you have to, coaches come and go, so you just have to draft the best players. You just have to draft good football players. And I think that is the testament to everything that we need to be doing right now. And it certainly suggests something very obvious that a lot of people are on board with: BPA. Aside from just positional value, whatever it might be. And of course, positional value is kind of a variable in BPA. But I will say that when it comes to drafting players to specific scheme fits, it doesn't feel like the Giants are going to go in that direction. It feels more so like they're going to take the best player available on their draft board, and they're not going to look back. Now, the Giants also mentioned something very interesting. The teams since 2017, every single team that's held the 25th overall pick has traded out of it. That is interesting. The Giants, meaning the probability is the Giants are going to trade out of that pick. However, Joe Schoen also mentioned the possibility that they have the draft capital with 10 selections to move up if they want to and get a player that they really like. So if there's someone falling that's high on their board and they want him, maybe it's Joey Porter, maybe it's Addison, maybe it's Zay Flowers, maybe they go up and take that guy. And it did sound very much like the Giants are keen on sticking with what they have at center. Now, of course, that could just be smoke and mirrors. They could be just, blowing smoke up everyone's ass to make sure that nobody sees it coming. So they are going to go out and get JMS or Luke Weipler or whatever it might be. But he referenced a lot of those interior offensive linemen as a potential transition options. Ben Bredesen, Shane Lemieux, J.C. Hassenauer. Like we see a lot of players here. And center, theoretically, you can survive with an average center, but you can't survive with average tackles, and you can't really survive with average interior guards. So that's kind of where the Giants, I see, may allocate draft capital in terms of if they feel okay at center. We may see them go after a guy like Osiris Torrance or something like that. We could see that happen. So I would keep an eye on that for sure. But it definitely seems like the Giants are keen on just going after good defensive players who don't necessarily fit a scheme mold, because Wink Martindale could be gone after this season, guys. He could be on his way out. The Giants just need good football players. We need Kayvon Thibodeau's. We need Bobby Okereke's. We need Adoree Jackson's. We need Dexter Lawrence's. We need guys who just play good football. Now, you look in the past, we had Dalvin Tomlinson, some guys that were stopping the run. Dexter Lawrence is capable of stopping the run, rushing the passer, kind of nose tackle, but he can play DE and move across the offensive line, or rather the defensive line. And same thing with Leonard Williams. Like, the Giants just need players. They need good players. Doesn't matter where they play necessarily. Good players find a way to make an impact. And that's kind of what Joe Schoen got at today, is that they're going to be looking to draft guys, not to draft guys specifically for Wink Martindale, but just to be good defensive players. So I think that cornerbacks, keep an eye on those. Defensive tackles, would not be surprised if the Giants went after a DT in this draft class, guys. I would not be surprised, because one thing he did reference was the front seven, as you mentioned, and he said we learned a lot about Wink Martindale's system last year, and we did not prepare well enough for what he runs, the type of defense he runs, and what it needs. Now, that doesn't mean you're going to be drafting players specifically to fit the scheme fit, but it's never a bad idea to have a ton of depth on the interior defensive line, because we ran out of gas there, and we just did not have the depth to step up and make plays. And good interior defensive line depth is going to go a long way in stopping the run this year, which makes the team one-dimensional, and then it makes them pass the ball more, and then having a good secondary goes a long way. You have Xavier McKinney coming back 100% healthy, Adoree Jackson 100% healthy, you got Cordell Flott, Aaron Robinson, maybe we draft another corner. I feel good about where we are right now in terms of the talent, but we have a long way to go, and I still think that we probably go with a BPA strategy, and it's possible we trade back on this draft class, since history would tell us that that's a probable course of action.
And listen, I wouldn't even discount the possibility of the Giants trading up. There's a chance that they trade down from 25, but I also do think there's a chance that they trade up. Joe Schoen did shed some insight and mention that the Giants, yes, are in fact scouting a lot of these top wide receivers, and as we know, many of them are projected to go before the 25th overall pick. Guys like Quentin Johnston, guys like Zay Flowers, guys like Jordan Addison, they might not make it all the way to the Giants' 25th overall draft selection, and I think that kind of looking at the history of that draft position, yeah, a lot of teams have been trading down recently. Wouldn't shock me. I think 25 is also a really good spot to trade up from. A lot of teams in those mid-teens would love to get to those mid-20s. It just makes a lot of sense for teams like that to try and gain some extra draft capital. And Joe Schoen also did mention today that they do have 10 draft picks, but he is absolutely open to using some of those picks to move up, to move down, not to move down, but to move up, or to trade for a veteran talent as well. And that's where we all say keep an eye on a guy like DeAndre Hopkins, because, again, the Giants looking for wide receivers. Joe Schoen saying they could move up to get one. They could also trade a draft pick, an extra pick, to try and acquire a veteran talent. So I do think it's worth noting, though, Alex, that Joe Schoen just sounds very open to the idea of moving. A lot of the times these pressers are done, and there's got to be a little bit of politicking going on, right? Like, Joe Schoen knows that other NFL teams are also listening, seeing the headlines. He talked a lot about Saquon Barkley today. Other teams are going to see the headlines about Saquon Barkley, add him to a little list of players that can be traded for. They're also going to go ahead and say, hey, intern, go Go see if Joe Schoen is willing to trade some draft picks. Oh, Joe Schoen said this about trading draft picks. Now another NFL GM knows that the Giants are open to making deals. And so, of course, with the Giants having so much draft capital, it's very, very possible that a team is going to take note of this and say, hey, I know that you guys have a lot of draft capital. Want to use some of it to trade up to my pick here over at 15 or 18 or wherever? I think that's something worth noting. And I think that Joe Schoen expressing some interest in trading is definitely something to take note of. Now, another thing that I want to talk about that Joe Schoen discussed today is the center position. He said that he feels like this class has a lot of depth, but he also said that he doesn't feel like the Giants need to draft a center in this upcoming draft. Now, I think you and I probably both disagree with him, Alex, but just kind of knowing that that's what he said, to be more specific, he said, yeah, I think there's some depth in the draft, but I don't think we have to. We have those meetings. As soon as the Eagles game was over that week, we had meetings. We went back into the offseason, and he kind of just continued by saying they had contingency plans for if Nick Gates and John Feliciano left, and J.C. Hassenauer, Lemieux, Jack Anderson, Ben Bredesen, those were some of those guys. But he said that he thinks it'll be a good competition and they don't necessarily need to draft a center. What are your thoughts on that, just kind of the center position? We've talked a lot about it recently. And what do you think the Giants' attack strategy for that position should be as we enter the draft?
Well, it's really tough because I feel like we haven't had a long-term solution at center in a really long time, and I'd love to have one, but there is an argument to make that there isn't an immediate above average center that's going to like blow us out of the water in 2023. Like, you're going to have to develop all of these guys. Like, even John Michael Schmitz, like NFL says he'll be a good starter within 2-3 years. So his rookie season is going to be accompanied by, problematic situations, challenges he has to overcome, adversity. So with that being said, maybe you just go and invest in other positions. Because, look, the reality is Luke Weipler, Tippmann, JMS, they're all going to cost you a first or second round pick. That's extremely valuable draft capital. You can find a starting level receiver or a starting level cornerback or a starting level interior lineman or pass rusher in those first 2 rounds. So I'll ask you this, Anthony. Knowing our needs, the positional value that we so often discuss, wouldn't it be more beneficial, and more logical to invest that draft pick in a position that is also a weakness, but is significantly more valuable in terms of the position? I think that makes kind of sense, doesn't it?
Yes, of course it makes sense. And it's something we've been discussing for weeks and something that I'm very much a proponent of drafting based on positional value. I don't necessarily subscribe to the best player available belief. I think that in a perfect world, yes, you can take the best player available, but most of the time NFL teams don't really have that luxury. It's the really good teams like the Kansas City Chiefs of the world that can go best player available. But a lot of times they don't even do that. They try and fill niche needs on their roster, get a specific gadget player for the offense that they think can add something. I don't think many teams truly go best player available. I think that the New York Giants did when they drafted Saquon Barkley, and I think you look at it a few years later, a lot of losing over the past few years, a lot of injuries to Saquon Barkley. Maybe it wasn't the best decision to go best player available in that situation. I think that's definitely something that people can debate. But if you're going by positional value, Saquon Barkley wasn't the number 2 overall pick because the running back position isn't all that valuable. So if the Giants are sitting there at 25 and they're going by positional value, center position obviously devalued in comparison to a wide receiver or a cornerback. But at the same time, if you're going by best player available, the best receiver on the board has a second round grade for Joe Schoen, but the best center has a first round grade. He's going to go ahead and probably take the center if he's going BPA. But I do think that it's a worthwhile debate to be had. We can all kind of chime in the comment section down below if you're listening on YouTube. You can mention, what do you think? Best player available or positional value? I definitely think that there's kind of a way to weigh it somewhere in the middle, because you want to fill your needs in this upcoming draft, but you also don't want to reach for your needs. And so I think it's always kind of an interesting mental game, mental gymnastics that NFL general managers have to kind of play with and go through to really find players to fit the right value of their draft pick. So I mean, if you're asking me what I think the Giants should do, I think they got to fill some needs here. This roster, it's good enough to compete. It's good enough to make it into the NFC playoffs and hopefully make it a little bit even further than last year. We were only 1 win away from the NFC Conference Championship game, and I'm not going to say that we were 1 player away, but maybe we were 1 good draft and free agency class away. That's possible. And the Giants did address a bunch of their needs in free agency. If they address a few more of them in the draft and those picks happen to pan out in year 1, you're talking about the Giants being contenders now. So I do think that when you're this close, when the Giants are this close from being contenders, and again, I do think they're a ways away from being Super Bowl contenders, but they made it deeper into the postseason than they had in the last decade. So I do think that it's something that the Giants should consider, is maybe we should be addressing some of these top needs to kind of make that final push, make our team win a couple extra games, and hopefully make it to the conference championship game. Or, of course, we're praying for the miracle where they get to the Super Bowl. Another thing that I want to mention, though, just kind of speaking about pushing us into the Super Bowl, we know Daniel Jones just got paid a big old bag this offseason, and they did that because they're hoping that he can be the quarterback to lead us to a Super Bowl victory, right? Well, the Giants have also been taking a look at a few of these quarterbacks in the draft, right? They've taken a look at Hendon Hooker, had him in for a top 30 visit. There's another quarterback, I can't remember his name. I think his last name is Toon. They also had him in for a visit. They've scouted a few of these quarterback prospects ahead of this draft. But Joe Schoen said today, our backup quarterback is, in fact, Tyrod Taylor. We are not looking for a developmental quarterback right now with Daniel Jones and Tyrod Taylor on the roster. He did go on to say that maybe they will add a third quarterback to the roster. He said there will be a third quarterback on the roster by the time we get to training camp, but he can't say whether or not he's targeting one in the draft. He doesn't know if it's going to be an undrafted free agent or another veteran. Last year they had Davis Webb, as we all know, but I do think it's interesting that Joe Schoen kind of made it clear that they're not planning on drafting a quarterback, yet they're scouting a couple of these quarterbacks really heavily. What do you make of that situation, Alex? And do you think that there is an outside chance that the Giants take a flyer on a mid-round developmental quarterback this year?
Yeah, absolutely. It's always a traditional good idea to draft a quarterback in the mid rounds with upside, Like that's always a good move because think about it this way. You find a quarterback that has some of the similar traits that Daniel Jones has, can run, can move, some developmental upside, and you develop him for a year. Tyrod Taylor's contract expires, and he assumes the role on a really cheap contract, and then opens up some more salary space for you. So yes, am I open to drafting a quarterback in the mid rounds with upside and athleticism? 100%. It just depends who, and I trust Brian Dable, I trust Mike Kafka, and I trust Shea Tierney and this coaching staff full of quarterback gurus to get it right and to do a good job and to develop a guy to even being a competent backup. And that's okay, right? Like, it's okay to be a competent backup. Look how many quarterbacks go down, and then the team needs someone to come in and win a game, win an important game, manage an important series, whatever it might be. Look at what, Brock Purdy did for the 49ers last year. Goes in, just plays game manager, does a good job. He's already taken Trey Lance's job right out from under him. We're talking about the third-round pick and the last-round pick from last year. So, Trey Lance the year before that, but, you get the point. There is a ton of value to be had. It's just about scouting the right guys. You're looking at Hendon Hooker as an option the Giants are really intrigued by, but I think that's more about gathering information than actually drafting Hendon Hooker, unless he was to drop significantly into maybe like the third round, which is unlikely, but I guess possible. Anything's possible in the draft. But I think the Giants will definitely draft the quarterback. I am 100% on board with that. I always think it's a good chance to take a shot because maybe you never know. You'll land a stud and suddenly you're set for life.
1,000%. And I think that the most recent example of that is, of course, Brock Purdy, who was mentioned by whichever reporter asked Joe Schoen the question about taking a mid-round or a late-round quarterback. They did specifically cite Brock Purdy as being the reason why a team might want to do that. And I do think that it's a good point to bring up, I don't think at any point where the San Francisco 49ers believing in the 7th round that they were getting their next starting quarterback, but with Trey Lance now on the trade block, it sounds like they might have with the final pick in last year's draft. So very interesting stuff there. And again, I do think that it helps ring home the point that you just made, Alex, that it's just good practice. The Giants should be looking at some of these mid-round quarterbacks to develop, whether that be a Hendon Hooker earlier in the draft or someone way later in the draft. I know there's a quarterback out of UCLA that a lot of fans like in the later rounds. So it'll be interesting to see what the Giants do in this draft. But it was a very informative presser today from Joe Schoen, I believe. I think that I gain a lot more out of the Joe Schoen pressers than I ever did from the Dave Gettleman pressers, for what it's worth. But Alex, any other quotes that really stood out to you from Joe Schoen today, or any main takeaways that you might have had that we didn't hit on just yet from the Joe Schoen presser?
I haven't talked to him lately. It's been 3 weeks. I'm just kidding. I feel like a lot of it was just stuff we know. They're not going to be giving any information away, and I think that's an important thing to realize, is that in the past, Dave Gettleman would give away information and be like, oh, like, wow, like you just gave us a nugget that we did not expect to get. Joe Schoen was very clear that the 25th overall pick, the value that I did gain was that he sees the 25th overall pick as a much more difficult spot to draft out of, right? And I think that's going to be the interesting variable here, is that when you're drafting 5 and 8 or, 2 and, the top guns, what these guys offer, you have a lot of film, you have a lot of knowledge. It's really easy. You take the best player there. It's Kayvon Thibodeau, Evan Neal. It's not that hard. But when you're drafting 25, the talent drop off after 15 becomes quite significant at times. And that's where you have to decide which one of these guys really is better than one another. It becomes a lot more difficult to draft BPA later on during the draft because you just don't know. There's so many players, and they made a couple good points, some of the reporters, that essentially because of that extra year of eligibility due to COVID, there's a lot more players in this draft class, and a lot of them are older, 24, 25 years old as rookies. So there's a lot more guys to scout. There's a lot more names in the fold here, and they're going on a case-by-case basis. There's hundreds and hundreds of players they have to know. And he said there's, a lot of receivers that go, obviously. So this is going to be interesting to see how the Giants really apply their value, apply their draft capital. But I will say this, be pretty intrigued by the concept of trading up or down. I think that we're going to see movement from this Giants team either in the first or second round, and that's a good thing. I think that if there's any draft to do that, even to get more draft capital, if you're unsure, they have a couple guys that are graded very similarly at 25, head on back, get some more draft capital, cash in, and then get some more good quality players who can at least fill depth rows or replace depth rows that have guys that may be on expiring contracts. That is a very good thing. You keep the price tag down. You bring in fresh legs. You bring in guys with upside and development. Your draft picks, a lot of our draft picks, by the way, a lot of our players on the team right now are still Dave Gettleman players or free agents we had to pick up or guys we scooped up from practice squads elsewhere. We're still building out the foundation of this team, and I expect them to utilize all of these draft picks, and there's going to be a lot of competition during training camp because of it.
That there certainly is, and I will say, for what it's worth, you kind of mentioned the COVID kids, right? The guys who are expanding the size of this draft pool. John Michael Schmitz is one of those players, for what it's worth. So, if Joe Schoen was mentioning that specifically, maybe he had a specific player on his mind. Maybe it was John Michael Schmitz. He is one of those players that took the extra year in college due to COVID. But another thing that I'll say, you kind of mentioned with how many first-round talents there is. It's very rare. I don't even know if it ever happens where an NFL team legitimately has 32 first-round draft grades that they hand out. For what it's worth, most NFL teams don't. Usually they get up to about 25 to 27, and that's where the first-round graded prospects kind of fall off for most teams. So the Giants really are picking this late in the draft on the cusp of having to draft a player that they might have with a round 2 grade in the first round, for what it's worth. So I do think it's interesting, and again, talking about trading up or trading down, if the Giants feel like there's no round 1 players on the board, they might want to move down to just get another one of those round 2 graded players, but also add in an extra round 5 graded player via a draft day trade, adding some extra capital later in the round. But also, maybe the Giants feel we got to walk away from this class with a first round graded player. We need to go ahead and trade up. I do think both of those are very strong possibilities. Joe Schoen is not afraid to be aggressive and go ahead and try to make the moves to make this roster as competitive as possible. So again, it's going to be really interesting. So many scenarios can play out. We're going to continue to discuss all the different possibilities right here on Fireside Giants, giving you guys the recap, the news, the rumors, the mock drafts right here with 1 week up until the 2023 NFL Draft. So please make sure to leave a like if you did enjoy this episode. Subscribe to the channel if you're new. Ring the bell so you don't miss an episode. And comment your thoughts down below. And also, if you're listening on Apple or Spotify, make sure to leave us a 5-star review. So we'll catch you all in the next one. Have a good one. And let's go Giants.